Greetings to everybody who's joined the China Studies Center International Research webinar to be given by Mark Blecher shortly. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which the University of Sydney is based. The land was never ceded, and we recognize the people who are the descendants of the original inhabitants, their elders, past, present, and emerging, and their traditions. It's my great pleasure today to hand over shortly to Joel Andreas, who will introduce Mark Blecher to talk about working class in China. This is a long anticipated international research webinar with two of the world's leading commentators on this very topic. Joel will moderate the questions that you may access, you may put to Mark and indeed to Joel by using the Q&A facility, the question and answer facility on in your Zoom package. So now I'll hand over to Joel, and I look forward to hearing the presentation and the discussion. Thank you both very much indeed.
Okay, well, thank you, David. Both David Goodman and Mark Blecher are old friends, and I'm happy to be here on this webinar with them. Mark Blecher is the professor of politics and East Asian studies at Oberlin College in Ohio. He's been traveling to China since the last years of the Mao era in the 1970s. When he was doing research for his dissertation on the relations between village leaders and villagers in rural China. And he's been studying that issue ever since, but many others, he's branched into many other related issues. And he's been studying various aspects of Chinese society and Chinese politics, and especially labor. And he's been, especially in recent years, he's written several books about labor in China, the history of labor in China. He's written 10 books overall, which I'm not going to go over all their titles. But he most recently co-authored a great 2-volume set with our host, David Goodman, and others, called Class in the Communist Party from 1921 to 2021. That's 2 volumes, covers that whole century. Today, we're going to discuss his 11th book, or he's going to discuss his 11th book, and we'll discuss it with him. It's titled A World to Lose, Working Class Formation in China from 1900 to 2020. He's still working on the final editing of the book, but I will turn it over to Mark, and we can hear about what's going to be in the book.
Thank you, Joel. Thanks, Ping. Thanks, David. Thanks to everyone for taking an hour out of your busy day, I'm sure, to listen to me go through this stuff. I welcome your questions, comments, criticisms today, but also, you know where to find me on email. As Joel said, there's still time to tighten up loose ends, and you can help me make the book better. Marx and Engels closed the Communist Manifesto with these time-honored words. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. In the 20th century, the Chinese working class did have the opportunity, and from time to time, it looked like they might be turning the trick. But in the end, they lost. How come? Chinese workers have been the subject of a great deal of analysis by scholars, documentation by journalists and activists, and portrayal by writers, filmmakers, and artists. I just saw a film last night called Ascension, which is about, just depicts various kinds of work done in China, and it's like a punch to the gut to see it. I can't recommend it enough. But that's an example of a portrayal by filmmakers of the questions of labor and working working class in China. All this work has shone light on a rich tapestry of economic, social, cultural, and political forces that have driven workers into low-paid, dangerous, degrading, alienating, mind-numbing, transient employment. On the obstacles to improving their condition, on workers' understandings of their world and their lives in it, on workers' passivity and resistance, and on the effects of their responses. Most recently, on the question of whether their responses have had any effect, I'll do a plug for a new book written by, I'm very proud to say, one of my honor students, Manfred Elfstrom, called Workers and Change in China, which is getting a terrific response. Anyway, my contribution, A World to Lose, seeks the foundation for all this in three questions. What kind of a class is the working class? What are the historical forces and processes that have formed it? And how does the pattern of class formation help explain the working class's reactions historically, presently, and even prospectively, including the fact that they lost the chance to lose their chance? An analogy might help here. Aficionados of crime literature, drama, and film, which many of us watched and read in earnest to while away the lockdown, watching detective shows, binge watching them, will recognize a familiar trope. There's a mountain of evidence that points toward the culprit with a motive, the opportunity, the resources, no alibi, and even the bad looks. But along comes the clever detective who has developed a sense of who the suspect is and believes that they are just not the sort of person who would or could commit the crime. Soldiering on doggedly in the face of disbelief and derision, the investigator, focusing not just on the details of the crime, but also the nature of the criminal, finally serves up justice by apprehending the real culprit. Likewise, scholarship on labor politics in China tends to focus directly on workers' manifest activities. Of what do their politics consist? What stimulates them? What forms do their politics take? Who leads? Who participates? And who doesn't? What obstacles do they face? What are their goals, tactics, and strategies? Do they target employers, the government, or both? What ideological formations do they entail? What results do they achieve? These and related questions can, I believe, best be approached in the context of a prior set of questions. Who are these workers in the first place? What is the Chinese working class? How has it developed since its birth over a century ago? As such, the focus here is on working class formation, understood as a noun, a formation as a thing, and also as a verb, as a process. What is the working class as a class? How did it become, over a long period of time, what it is? My inquiry draws inspiration from scholarship on political development, which has contributed so much to understanding American and Western European politics by seeking the roots of present-day outcomes in their historical origins. This is a different usage of political development than the one associated with modernization theory in the 60s and 70s. It started in American political development, and American political scientists who did this work, Ira Katznelson, Theda Skocpol, Paul Pearson, many others. The political development approach pays attention to questions of path dependency, the ways in which economic, social, cultural, and political institutions, including formal and even legal ones, but also widely shared norms, expectations, and practices, all those figure as institutions in this language. How did these institutions arise and become settled in ways that came to be taken for granted, proved difficult to change, and as such had enormous, if often overlooked, implications for outcomes ever since. The political development approach also focuses on historical sequences and conjunctures as causal or influencing mechanisms in themselves. The order in which things happen and the specific, what else was going on at the moment that they happened, the sequences and conjunctures themselves can be causal or influencing mechanisms in outcomes. That's what political development approach tries to do. As such, I hope my book will aim, well, it does aim, and I hope it succeeds somewhat, in beginning to fill a curious lacuna in scholarship on Chinese labor politics. That in the study of so ancient and historically continuous a civilization, country, and polity, the past is still deployed mainly as background or context, and an often reified one, but not, the past is not conceived itself as a dynamic space in which the durability or continuity of institutions and the concatenation of specific forces at specific moments actually shaped outcomes in specific ways. Already, three major conceptual and theoretical problems have arisen. First, for the past 175 years, Chinese politics have demonstrated significant path independence and radical discontinuity. The political development approach usually talks about path dependence, how something happened 100 years ago and it's set in almost in stone, developments that have shaped outcomes ever since. But when we apply it to China, the political development approach must de-emphasize positive feedback loops and institutional self-reinforcement that are central to the ways in which it has analyzed real existing democracy and capitalist political economy. Instead, if we're applying this to China, we have to look at the politics of radical change. Let me skip over a paragraph or two here about that. But we have to pay attention to the ways in which discontinuity shaped outcomes rather than continuity shaped outcomes. All right, second is the question of the working class, which conjures up, of course, a thicket of conceptual, theoretical, analytical, and political problems. Starting with the first of its elements, should conceptualization of the working class focus on the nature of work itself, in which case it would include anyone who does manual labor, even if they're self-employed and perform their work outside a factory, or should it, or not? Should it include mental and professional work, such as that done by doctors or even professors who write sentences like this one? Should it be grounded in the economic, social, and political relations of work, so that it features those toiling together with fellow workers at her wage and factories? Turning to the second term, class, working class, do large numbers of workers, however defined, form a working class, or is that better conceived as something greater than merely the sum of its parts? Now let's add formation into the mix. If there is a working class, and there may not be, or there may be in one sense, but not another sense, how is it formed historically? Should the process of forming a working class be thought of rather strictly, or as critics would have it, in sort of vulgar Marxist terms, Marxian terms, if you like, as a teleology? This is very familiar to us. Workers get exploited and experience punishing manual labor that produces oppressive social relations, with employers and shared bonds among workers, which in turn engender collective class consciousness, all of which lead workers to band together politically to do something about it. So you move from the economic to the social to the cultural and finally the political in a kind of a straight line. That's the sort of vulgar teleological approach. I think following Katznelson and others, and E.P. Thompson, who wrote on British workers, that the process is much more indeterminate, recursive, and even complex than that. Katznelson developed a conceptual framework to sort through these issues. At its core is the idea that class as a concept has four distinct aspects, which I have denoted in shorthand as economic, social, cultural, and political, and which I've just used. The economic is the strictly material one, rooted in the mode of production. How much are workers exploited? What's the wage relationship? Exploitation used here is in a kind of dry sense of how much surplus value do they generate and have expropriated from them. Not in the emotional sense of you're exploiting me. In state socialism, the economic is structured by the decommodification of labor in favor of treating it as a use value. Compensation is delinked from actual labor contribution, and appropriation of the product is done by the state for social distribution and various purposes, including reinvestment. So that's the economic bit. Even Marx and more thoughtful Marxians have long realized, of course, that the economic aspect of class is necessary to conceptualize a working class, but that it can also never suffice to explain or chart the social, cultural, or political life of what Marx called the proletariat. In capitalism, the stark facts of private ownership, the means of production, wage labor, appropriation of the products of labor by capitalists do not by themselves imply anything very specific about workers' incomes, wealth, and economic conditions. Much less do the relations of production and appropriation of the surplus lead to specific patterns of working class social life, consciousness, or politics. Nonetheless, the latter three, the social, cultural, and political politics of working class, are shaped by economic structures, but not in any particularly simple or easily determined way. So that's the economic. The social is, I'll quote Katznelson, social aspect of class is, to quote him, the social organization of society lived by actual people in real social formations that affect the ways workers experience the world, and including the mode of production and the economic life that they live and produce and experience. Here, by contrast with the cold, bare material aspects of class and labor, how much wages, how much profits, and what are working conditions, and so on. Here, the focus is on the existential, quotidian, and phenomenological. How does it feel? How does it look? It includes elements that are not strictly economic or determined by the basic facts of the mode of production, such as the size and composition of the working class, the relationship between workplaces and residential spaces. Katznelson himself made a great deal out of this. Do workers live in the same places where they work or not? And he found that was extremely important in explaining the American working classes shift from orientation to labor to orientation toward residential issues and urban politics, education, and urban electoral politics, and so on. The social element of class, aspect of class, also includes social status, social and power relations, and hierarchies within the factory, and so on. All right, the third is the cultural aspects of class, refer to workers' shared dispositions, if they exist. Katznelson defines this as the ways people construct meaning to make their way through the experienced world, or, quote, the plausible and meaningful thought responses to the circumstances workers find themselves in. He specifically rejects the term consciousness as too deterministic and teleological. How much working class consciousness do you have, a lot or a little? And he prefers wisely, I think, more open-ended questions about the kinds of social and political affinities that workers conceive as most important or salient. How and how much do workers think of themselves as having something in common with other workers who are similarly situated within the structures of the economy and of daily life, of the economic and the social? Beyond class, how and how much do they identify with the nation, with their place of origin, their gender, their secret society, their institutions, such as parties and unions? Is their outlook forward-looking or atavistic, optimistic or pessimistic, accommodative, syndicalist, socialist, or something else? How do these different identities interact? Finally, for Katznelson, the political aspects of class refer to organization and collective action. What are the institutions of working class politics? Parties, unions, other kinds of associations and social movements? What are the stimuli, repertoires, and demands? Is their politics contentious or accommodative? In what ways does collective action depend on the emergence of political opportunities to create openings? Is their politics patterned as isolated incidents or as waves, or in rhythm with economic upturns or downturns? How politicized is their politics? Do workers target the state, or do they target employers, foreigners, or, quote, others, unquote, to bring in identity politics? Do they form unions, parties, movements, or other collectivities? Do they strike, hold political demonstrations, or other political actions? Finally, there is the question of the state's response. How does it mix coercion, cooptation, manipulation, and accommodation? Katznelson's major conceptual and methodological point is that there is no simple or straightforward theoretical or historical relationship among these four aspects of class: the economic, social, cultural, and political. He's trying to undermine any simplistic sort of, quote, base and superstructure theory. I went through some of that before. The process of class formation is, for him, quote, the conditional but not random process of connection among these four aspects of class. And in all this, he's following E.P. Thompson, who found, for example, that workers didn't start to understand that they were workers until they went out and protested with other workers together as workers. They didn't form their, quote, class consciousness, if you like, until they actually engaged in politics. So their consciousness was a result of the politics and not the other way around, that kind of thing. Okay, now all this does not form a theory of class formation. Katznelson's argument is that there cannot be a robust theory that explains working class formation always and everywhere. Rather, what he's offering is a conceptual and analytical scheme for explaining and comparing particular cases. It enables us to pose important questions by deploying working class formation as a noun. How fully and coherently developed was working class formation in a particular time and place, and what are the political implications? Let me skip ahead a little bit to save a little bit of time, because I do want to talk about China. Yeah, so let me leave it at that there's lots of different questions that can come up here, and I think you can begin to see what some of them would be. What my manuscript has done is I've organized it according to this analytical scheme. It's divided into three parts. First, before 49, working class formation in China took place amidst the crisis of the ancien regime, and after 1920, the protracted struggle between two hegemonic projects, one of the Kuomintang to build a republic, and the other by the Communist Party for socialist revolution. That's the first chapter. Second chapter, from 49 to 78, the victory of the revolution led to titanic, contradictory exertions of the party state to try to construct a new hegemony around radical, yet also developmental state socialism. How did the working class fit into that and get reshaped by that? How did it form and reform, re-form, not reform, but in the Maoist era? And then third, beginning in 78, the party state sought to rebuild its hegemony around a new foundation of deep structural reform of the economy. And how did that shape and reshape working class formation? What kind of formation did it produce, or did it deform the working class, and so on? And so for each of these periods, the book conceptualizes working class formation in terms of the myriad interactions among these four aspects of class. So already you're starting to see, I'm starting to feel a little bit like the late, great Eric Olin Wright. I've got threefold conceptualization in four periods. I can see a 4x3 chart, matrix, and so on. But that's the structure of the book. Okay. Let me, what is it, 6:30. I'm here at 6:30 on Tuesday evening, sorry. Let me map this onto China and sketch it out. This is probably the part you kindly decided to turn up for. The first chapter on the Republican and Revolutionary decades, roughly 1920 to 1949. At the economic level, exploitation and immiseration of labor was intense throughout. In order to cope, we move to the social level, workers elaborated a complex set of social relations and organizations. Moving to the cultural level, to express their misery and their shock, working in factories and in industry was a huge shock to the first generation of workers who had been farmers before and suddenly found themselves in this completely different world, in the same ways that British and workers on the continent in the US who came from the countryside found themselves in a world they just didn't understand and found shocking, to repeat that word. To express this and cope with it, Chinese workers developed and articulated ways of thinking that combined themes of class, nation, and ardent humanism. And here I'm very influenced by the work of Steve Smith, his terrific book called Like Cattle and Horses, where so much of the time workers just cried out, a kind of cri de coeur, the cry of the heart, don't treat us like cattle and horses. Across much of this period, the working class took the initiative to organize itself in powerful but locally and regionally bounded waves of strikes and protests, especially in the 1920s. this experience of but also in the 1940s, when there was another peak of working class protest in the cities where the Communist Party had quote liberated unquote the city from the Kuomintang. So this experience of activism on a local basis, locally bounded basis, continued to propel labor activism in the radical state socialist and structural reform periods that followed. Workers' activism in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then beyond, I believe is a product of the real and repeated activism from before 1949. The Communist Party was founded in 1920 by radical intellectuals, not by workers. It's a point we all know, but I think its importance is sometimes overlooked. The party endeavored to provide political leadership to the working class, which did enable the labor movement to begin to transcend the local boundaries of its resistance and activism in the early and mid-20s, the strikes around Hong Kong and Guangzhou in the early and mid-20s, and again the later 40s. The party was able to help workers elaborate their resistance on a bigger regional and even national canvas in the mid-20s and the 40s. The White Terror of April 27, which we all know, was proved to be a watershed. In the language of political development, it would be called here's a fancy word I learned myself just in the last year, a non-ergodic moment, which means a moment the effects of which could not subsequently be canceled out, a moment in which that stamped subsequent events ever since. That's what non-ergodic means. The White Terror of 27 drove the party into the countryside, separated it and the working class over the next two crucial formative decades, and enabled the party to develop without workers and working class to develop without the party. We all know this, but the more I've thought about this, the more I came to realize how absolutely crucial this was. Moreover, and this is the question of conjuncture that goes with political development theory. The period before 49 was conjunctural with the rise of autocracy in urban China under the nationalists and Japanese occupation. Ari Zolberg, who co-edited with Ira Katznelson this very important book called Working Class Formation in Europe, wrote in there, quote, "The single most important determinant of variation in the patterns of working class politics is simply whether, at the time this class was being brought into being by the development of capitalism, it faced an absolutist or liberal state." Let me read that again. Quote, "The single most important determinant of variation in the patterns of working class politics is simply whether at the time this class was brought into being by the development of capitalism, it faced an absolutist or liberal state." What Zolberg has in mind is why working class politics in, say, the Nordic countries and Germany took a social democratic form, whereas in Southern Europe, it fueled fascism. And in Britain, it fueled a third type. In China, the fact that the working class really began to form at a moment a moment when politics was dominated by an absolutist state, had two big effects. One, it reinforced the radical class-based politics by preventing the development of reformist or community-based working class politics. It drove workers into radicalism rather than co-opting them into a democratic reformist politics. The Kuomintang did try to co-opt workers, of course, into yellow unions, but it mainly that just drove workers into further resistance rather than into a politics of reform and business unionism, like in the US, for example. Okay, so it radicalized the fact that working class formation occurred at the same moment and under authoritarianism radicalized the working class at the time of its birth. At the same time, though, the working class lost its left-wing activists and party leadership, which were necessary for developing any capacity for organization and mobilization on a regional, much less national scale. Nonetheless, the working class continued to mobilize itself in various, if limited ways, under unfavorable conditions of nationalist autocracy, Japanese occupation, and civil and anti-imperial, and indeed world war. So these three developments, separation from the Communist Party, the autocratic context, and political deficits of the working class at the regional and national levels in the 1920s and again all the way through the 40s, produced a working class politics that was active, spontaneous, radical, and hostile to political leadership and authority. It produced a politics. Joel has written a fabulous book about this. It's a politics that I call in the Maoist period, workerist, or we might call it syndicalist. Workers just standing up for themselves, but not rather than following the party or being organized into the party. All right, what have I got? 5 minutes left. At the same time, though, the Communist Party became consolidated and battle-hardened in relative isolation from the working class over the same period after it was expelled from the cities. So the Chinese working class emerged into the state socialist period with a lot of political experience, but also with definite autonomy from and disillusionment with political authority generally. Okay. And as the party came to power, it faced the prospect of ruling with little, if any, base in the working class. All right, let me skip ahead. Chapter 2 explores the radical state socialist period of the People's Republic. The new party state was founded before any institutional or political incorporation of the working class. It did not significantly increase working class representation, much less power within its ranks, which is a path-dependent effect of its separation and alienation from the workers after 27. The way the political development language would talk about this is the party was a, quote, early arriver, unquote, on the political scene. It created and filled new radically expanded political space, but it did so long before the working class was also able to do anything similar and organize itself. And so the party arrived and then was on the political scene and could consolidate power without the working class. That's the sort of capsule version of this. I'm skipping over a load of stuff here because I see the clock is ticking away. Nonetheless, the party significantly improved wages, benefits, and labor conditions, exalted workers' social status, and concentrated them in all-encompassing factory-run communities. We all know this. My argument is these were not just gifts from the new government, but they were very much the products of working class activism over previous decades. If you look at the 50s, the reason the state oversaw a lot of the stuff that's in Joel's book is that it wasn't just a giveaway from the party to the workers, but the fact that the workers had fought for this through their syndicalist kind of political activity. In terms of the social, working class social capacities increased sharply in this period, but the state developed the social capacities of the state developed even more. Culturally, the workers developed and evinced a workerist sensibility, as I've said. Workers' politics in the Maoist period was often extremely radical. We know this from Liz Perry's work on the Cultural Revolution, from Joel's work on workers' councils, and so on. So their politics was radical, but it also explains their defeat because they didn't have any institutional glue to hold their politics together. They were dependent on that of the state, which was excluding them. So that's the broad brush argument of the second chapter. The third chapter, got a minute to go. Joe will give me 2 more minutes. I'll finish this up. Turns to the structural reform period beginning in 78. In the 80s, labor radicalism of the Cultural Revolution remained fresh in the minds of workers, and it cowed managers and officials into delaying structural reform. But by the early 90s, labor, quote, reform, unquote, broke through alongside reforms of prices, planning, ownership, and management. The party state began to dismantle factory communities, as Joel has shown, the Iron Rice Bowl, housing communities, and so on. Wages and economic life conditions waxed and waned. The most massive and rapid wave of proletarianization in world history, the greatest expansion of a working class anywhere in world history, has occurred in China over the past 30 years. This resulted in the working class becoming far more socially heterogeneous and widely distributed across the country, and more dispersed. The working class became much more heterogeneous culturally, evincing patterns of atavism, backward looking to the good old days of the Maoist period, acquiescence, often attraction and repulsion to the new cities. Workers are drawn in, but then repelled by what they find when they get there. Labor protest has become endemic, but also now, as we know, defensive and apolitical. And I believe this can be explained by the working class's experience of having lost out during the Maoist period, and particularly the Cultural Revolution. So in the end, Chinese workers have come to accept broadly the hegemony of capitalist and market relations, even as they protest within them, but are not incorporated into any institutions of collective bargaining or anything like that, as we know. All this helps explain why the Chinese working class, which has been active and stood up for itself since its formation in the 20s and repeatedly resisted what was being done to it, nonetheless always lost. It lost before 49, it lost in the Maoist period, it's losing now, but it lost in different ways and in each period, but for reasons that depended on the previous losses historically. I'll stop there. I have written this all out. And I'd be delighted to send it to you, to anybody who's interested in reading it and picking through it and helping me make it better. Thank you for listening.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mark. And everybody, am I back online? Maybe so. Okay. It sounds like a great book, and I'm looking forward to reading it. I enjoyed your presentation, and I did read your synopsis of the book, and it really looks like you've got a lot of insights. You shared a lot of the insights about the period before 49, which you went into in depth, and I think that I like the way you set up the dynamic between the Communist Party and the working Chinese workers, and the relationship between them, and how it changed over time. You kind of, because you were rushing through the last two chapters, you kind of lost that thread of the relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese working class that you had developed in the first chapter in your presentation today. For my first question, I'd just like you to try to sum up your last two chapters again with that as a central thread. What happened to the relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese working class during the Mao era, and then during the post-Mao era, and how has it evolved?
Okay, try to do this quickly. Starting in the 50s, workers resisted the efforts of the party to, often resisted the efforts of the party to reorganize factories and to herd workers into one-man management along Soviet lines. You have written a lot about this. I rely a lot on Mark Fraser's wonderful book on this. In the early 50s, workers, for example, called out Chairman Mao and denounced Communist Party cadres. They called them Texacos. Texaco is the American petroleum company that had a red star for its symbol, and they made fun of the party and just said, we're not listening. It was almost anarchistic, or better, syndicalistic. And they just said, this is what I meant by workerism. They stood up for themselves, not under party leadership and often against the party. And that's why you have written, Joel, about how they worked through party state established factory councils and so on. But when you get to the Cultural Revolution, they burst through that, and their politics, as Liz has written about, was often very radical. But they were standing up for themselves with a language, if you want to talk about the cultural aspect of politics, that was drawn from Maoist radicalism, radical concepts and slogans, radical Maoist politics of the Cultural Revolution period, but they were very much standing up for themselves rather than for socialism or advancing socialism in the ways that even the Cultural Revolution left stood for. So their resistance often was self-propelled, using language and ideas given to them by the Maoist left, but they were not incorporated in any institutions. They formed their own. They had not been much incorporated into the party, and they formed their own Red Guard groups to attack the party. And then, of course, when the left lost, they lost as well. So that's the Maoist period. In the structural reform period, the short version is we know that there are strikes every day in China. The working class still evinces a great deal of radicalism, but it's defensive rather than offensive. In the it's apolitical, whereas in the Maoist period it was syndicalist and kind of political. The workers wanted to run the factories, and often, again, some workers, not all, but their politics was politically radical in the Maoist period. Well, it's not politically radical at all. It's just trying to get paid, and it's defensive, and they can win a little, but mostly they lose. They don't act. They're decentralized. They don't act as a class. They just act as, one factory at a time. They have not managed to produce strike waves to be reckoned with. They almost did in the early very first years of the 21st century in the Northeast, but then a strike wave fizzled out. And so their protest is disaggregated, disorganized, and not particularly effective. Although Manfred Elbstrom says that in the end, the state is trying to give a few things kind of globally in national policy terms in order to just quiet this down. I don't know if that did a better job of filling in some of the blanks.
Yeah, but at least in my next question, which I'll ask you really quick, we want to take questions from the audience as well. But in the Mao era and leading up to the Mao era even, but then particularly in the Mao era, I can see you tend in your book to talk about the working class as a collective actor all the way through. This class did this, the class did that. And and it had some kind of common consciousness. It was a formed class. It was a class that had gone through class formation and then become formed. And during the Mao era, you can sort of see that they have similar conditions. They have a high idea of that they are a class. They have largely because the state set them up that way. In some ways, they had common conditions in the factories, and where they were celebrated, put on a pedestal, like you say, of a working class, and they definitely saw themselves as a class. It's harder for me to see them as a collective actor today and as a conscious class. They're so varied. I mean, people who work for a living are wage earners in China. They include some of these the old working class in the state-owned factories, which are being a lot of them have been laid off, and they're retiring, and there's younger people there, but it's a very different situation. And then you have migrant workers, you have workers working for these platform delivery services, you have all kinds of different workers in different conditions. And I'm wondering if you can still feel like you can understand them as a collective actor in some ways, the way you talk about them in previous decades.
No, I think what I'm trying to say, and I guess I was in trying to sum this up very quickly, I wasn't clear enough about this, is that you can talk about the working class as just a kind of collectivity, everybody who works, we call them a class, but I completely agree. They are, the title of the third chapter of the book is the deformation of the working class. So it's unformation, that they struggled to form. If a class is more than the sum of its parts, and they struggled to do that before 49, and the party tried to provide leadership for that, but then was cut off from them. In the Maoist period, I agree with you completely. The party kind of formed them more into a class, but they, by homogenizing, as you said, their lives and their incomes and so on, but but they so a class has four levels, and socially they began to think of themselves as a class, and culturally they began to use Maoist language and Marxist language to talk about themselves as a class, but in political terms, they didn't have any institutions of their own. So economically, they're a class. They're all in similar conditions, like you just said. Socially, they all work together. They're bonded, yes. Culturally, they begin to think of themselves that way, but politically, they're not a class. So that's Katznelson's point. Instead of saying, are you a class or not, or how much class formation do you have, how much of a class are you? Well, in this respect, you're a class. In this respect, you're not a class. That's kind of the beauty for me of Katznelson's argument. So in the Maoist period, politically, they were not a class, unable to act together. Well, that's not right. They acted together, but and in very radical ways. But then they lost. They lost out. And then in the present period, they're more of a class than ever, in some sort of Marxian sense, because of the advance of capitalism and the ways in which they have been subjected to that. But socially, within a factory, they often see the affinity with each other, but they have no way of talking about it nationally, no cultural media to propagate a concept. They don't think of themselves as having much in common with workers in other factories, and certainly they have no, at the political level, they're not a class. That would be the way I'm trying to